I'm Violet, 28 female. I live in a modest apartment in the city, a quiet little world I've built for myself far from the opulent chaos of my family. By day, I'm a forensic accountant, a job that suits my personality perfectly. I find truth in numbers, and numbers never lie, unlike people. This is the story of how my father tried to publicly destroy me at my cousin's wedding. Not knowing that my boring, detail-oriented job had given me the exact skills I needed to dismantle his entire empire. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. The wedding was exactly as you'd imagine for the golden child of the family, my cousin Sophia. It was held at a sprawling vineyard estate that my father, Arthur, probably had some financial stake in. Everything was draped in white silk and fairy lights, a scene straight from a magazine spread designed to scream effortless elegance, when, in reality, it was the product of a year of relentless, micromanaged planning. My family, the Prestons, didn't do things by half. We didn't celebrate milestones, we curated brand experiences. For Sophia, a budding social media influencer, this wedding wasn't just a union of two people. It was premium content. Every floral arrangement, every crystal glass, every carefully selected appetizer was an investment in her public image, an image largely funded and directed by my father, her adoring uncle. I, on the other hand, was the family's quiet anomaly. The black sheep not for any rebellious act, but for my sheer, unforgivable ordinariness. I hadn't chosen a flashy career. I didn't marry into wealth. I didn't project the image of success my father demanded. My job as a forensic accountant was, in his words, a glorified bookkeeping position for someone who isn't ambitious enough to make real money. He saw my meticulous work, my ability to trace narratives through complex financial records, as nothing more than a glorified hobby. He wanted a daughter who was a shark in a designer suit, a headline grabber. Instead, he got me, someone who preferred spreadsheets to speeches and logic to legacy. This fundamental disappointment was the reason I found my name card tucked away at table 19, the furthest one from the head table, nestled near the kitchens. It was a motley crew of distant relatives and plus ones who didn't quite make the A-list. I didn't mind. In fact, I was grateful. It allowed me to be a silent observer, a role I was far more comfortable with. From my vantage point, I could see the whole performance. I watched my father, Arthur, glide through the crowd, his hand resting proudly on Sophia's shoulder. He was in his element, the patriarch basking in the glow of his success, personified by his beautiful, popular niece. My mother passed away when I was a teenager, and with her went any semblance of warmth in my relationship with my father. She was the buffer, the translator of his harsh ambitions into something resembling paternal care. After she was gone, all that remained was his cold, transactional view of the world. Success was currency, and I simply wasn't earning my keep in the family portfolio. He'd invested in my education, expecting a return in the form of a high-powered lawyer or a surgeon. When I chose accounting, he acted as if I'd declared bankruptcy on his dreams for me. Sophia, on the other hand, was the perfect investment. She was beautiful, charming, and understood the modern currency of influence. Her Instagram feed was a carefully polished gallery of the life my father wanted our family to represent: luxury, leisure, and public adoration. He poured money into her brand, funding her travels, her wardrobe, and now, this fairy tale wedding. He saw her as the daughter he should have had, the one who understood the importance of image. My Aunt Alina, my mother's sister and my only real ally in the family, found me at table 19. She was a retired librarian, a woman whose quiet strength and gentle wisdom had been my lifeline for years. She squeezed my shoulder, her eyes full of a familiar mixture of sympathy and anger. "Table 19, Violet, really," she murmured, her voice low, "your own father." I managed a small smile. "It's fine, Alina, better view of the exit from here." She didn't smile back. "He's peacocking, that's all, trying to pretend he's the king of this little kingdom he's built. Don't let him get to you." He stopped getting to me a long time ago, I lied. The truth was, it always stung. Every dismissive comment, every blatant comparison to Sophia was a fresh cut. I had just gotten better at hiding the wounds. We watched as the wedding party made their grand entrance. Sophia was radiant, her smile wide and camera-ready. Her new husband looked like he'd been hand-picked from a catalog of handsome, agreeable men. My father stood beside beaming, looking every bit the proud benefactor. He raised his glass to the crowd, and it was clear he saw this entire event as his own personal achievement. Dinner was served, a multi-course affair that probably cost more than my car. The small talk at my table was harmless. A distant cousin asked what I did for a living, and when I said forensic accountant, he nodded politely and immediately turned to talk to someone else. I was used to it. My world of numbers and audits was a foreign language in a family that only spoke in terms of deals, status, and appearances. As the evening wore on, the clinking of glasses signaled the start of the toasts. The best man gave a charming, generic speech. The maid of honor, one of Sophia's influencer friends, delivered a toast that sounded suspiciously like a sponsored post. And then it was my father's turn. He stood up, champagne flute in hand, and the room fell into a respectful silence. He was a charismatic speaker, a skill he'd honed in countless boardrooms. He commanded attention. He started by praising the happy couple, his voice booming with manufactured warmth. He spoke of Sophia's grace, her beauty, her ambition. "She is the very picture of a modern, successful woman," he declared, his eyes sweeping the room. "She has built something for herself, a brand, a future. She embodies the Preston spirit." He paused for effect, letting the words hang in the air. I felt a familiar knot tighten in my stomach. I knew this rhythm. The praise for Sophia was always a prelude to the criticism of me, even if it was implied. But I wasn't prepared for him to make it explicit. Not here, not in front of everyone. My father held his glass a little higher, a self-satisfied smile playing on his lips. The fairy lights twinkled around him, casting a glow that made him look almost benevolent, a stark contrast to the venom he was about to spew. His gaze scanned the room, passing over the faces of business partners, friends, and family, before it landed, with deliberate, crushing weight, on me. Right on me, at my sad little table in the back. "Look at her," he boomed, gesturing with his glass not towards the bride, but towards the back of the room, towards me. "Sophia is what a real daughter looks like, a daughter a father can be proud of." The room, which had been filled with warm murmurs of agreement, began to quiet. A few heads turned, confused, following his line of sight. My heart started hammering against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This couldn't be happening. He wasn't done. He lowered his voice slightly, adopting a tone of mock sympathy that was 1,000 times more cruel than outright anger. Not like the failure sulking in the back. The word struck me with physical force. Failure, sulking in the back. It was as if he'd reached across the entire room and slapped me. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of shock and disbelief. Every single person in that grand, opulent hall turned their heads. One by one, like a slow, synchronized wave of judgment, they turned to stare at me. 200 pairs of eyes, all focused on table 19, on the family disappointment. In that moment, time seemed to slow down. I could see every detail with excruciating clarity, the pity in some faces, the morbid curiosity in others, the faint, triumphant smirk on Sophia's perfectly made-up lips. She wasn't shocked. She was pleased. This was part of her coronation. My humiliation was the final jewel in her crown. My father had just publicly validated her superiority, cementing her status as the true heir to his affection and approval. My entire body went cold. I felt a hot flush of shame creep up my neck, but I fought it back. I refused to cry. I refused to run. That's what he wanted. He wanted me to break to prove him right. He wanted the world to see the weak, emotional daughter he always claimed I was, so I did the only thing I could think of. I lifted my chin, met his cold, triumphant gaze from across the room, and I forced a smile. It was a small, tight, brittle thing, a mask of composure that cost me every ounce of strength I had. I even raised my water glass in a mock toast, a tiny act of defiance that only he and I would understand. His eyes narrowed. It wasn't the reaction he'd expected. He'd wanted tears, a scene, a dramatic exit. My quiet, chilling smile unnerved him. He faltered for a second, the flow of his speech momentarily broken. He cleared his throat and tried to recover, turning his attention back to the bride and groom. "To Sophia and Mark," he finally said, his voice lacking the triumphant finality he'd intended. The room, grateful for the release, echoed his toast, but the energy was gone. The festive atmosphere had been shattered, replaced by a thick, awkward tension. People were whispering, casting furtive glances my way. The spell of the perfect wedding was broken. My father had shown them the ugly machinery Benny. At the polished exterior. Aunt Aliner's hand found mine under the table, her grip firm and grounding. "We're leaving," she whispered, her voice trembling with fury. "No," I whispered back, my eyes still locked on my father, who was now accepting pats on the back as if he'd just delivered the world's most inspiring speech. "If I leave, he wins. I'm not running." I sat through the rest of the reception in a state of surreal calm. The shame was still there, a hot coal in my stomach, but something else was beginning to form around it, a cold, hard resolve. For years, I had absorbed his disappointment. I had internalized his narrative that I was less than because I didn't fit his mold. I had accepted my place at the back, both literally and figuratively. But in his moment of ultimate cruelty, he had miscalculated. He thought he was delivering a final, crushing blow. Instead, he had just handed me a declaration of war. He had publicly disowned me, and in doing so, he had severed the last thread of familial obligation that held me back. He had no idea what I was capable of. He saw a quiet accountant. He didn't see the woman who could find a single lie buried in a mountain of data, the woman who could follow a money trail through a labyrinth of shell corporations. He saw a failure. He was about to find out just how wrong he was. The smile on my face, the one I held for the rest of the night, was no longer forced. It was real. It was the smile of a woman who had just found her purpose. He thought he knew what a real daughter looked like. I was about to show him what a real reckoning looked like. The numbers in my head were already starting to turn, not with emotion, but with cold, calculating precision. Every company he owned, every deal he'd ever made, every tax return he'd ever filed, it all just became a data set to be analyzed. And I am very, very good at my job. The week after the wedding was a blur of feigned normalcy. I went to work, I analyzed financial statements for my clients, I made polite conversation with my colleagues. But beneath the surface, a silent, methodical process had begun. The humiliation at the reception hadn't just broken my heart, it had sharpened my focus. My father's words echoed in my mind not as an insult, but as a hypothesis. He had built an empire, a flawless public image of success and integrity. My new, self-appointed job was to audit that image. I didn't know what I was looking for, not yet. It started as a vague, gnawing suspicion. Men like my father, men who are obsessed with appearances and project an aura of untouchable power, often have the most to hide. Their glossy exteriors are designed to deflect scrutiny. He had called me a failure. I wondered what the balance sheet of his own life truly looked like, stripped of the branding and the bluster. My investigation didn't begin with his business records. That would come later, and it would require a level of access I didn't yet have. It began in a much quieter, more personal place, my Aunt Aliner's attic. On the Saturday following the wedding, I drove to her cozy, book-filled house in the suburbs. She knew something had shifted in me. She didn't press for details, she just welcomed me with a hug and a pot of tea, sensing that I needed sanctuary. "I need to look through Mom's old things," I told her, my voice steady. "The boxes you kept after she passed." She nodded, her expression soft with understanding. "They're all upstairs. Take all the time you need." The attic was warm and smelled of aging paper and cedar. In the corner, stacked neatly, were several boxes labeled Helen's Memories. My mother. For years, it had been too painful to go through them. My father had cleared out her belongings from our home with an almost surgical efficiency after her death, keeping only a few sterile, curated photos for display. The real, messy, tangible parts of her life had been boxed up and sent to her sister's house, out of sight and out of mind. I spent hours sifting through the past. There were her college yearbooks, letters she'd written to my aunt, half-finished knitting projects, and albums filled with photographs. It was in the third album, one with a faded floral cover, that I found it. The picture was tucked away at the very back, behind the plastic sleeve. It was a candid shot, slightly out of focus, taken at what looked like a company picnic or a summer party. My father was in the center of the frame, younger, maybe in his early 30s, with the same confident posture he had today. He had his arm around a man I didn't recognize, but it wasn't the man that caught my eye. It was the sign in the background, partially obscured by a tree. It was a corporate logo, Bridgewater Development. I frowned. I had never heard of Bridgewater Development. My father's company, the one he had built from the ground up, the one that was his entire identity, was called Preston Holdings. According to the family legend, he'd repeated. At every holiday dinner, he started Preston Holdings with nothing but a small loan and sheer force of will. It was his masterpiece, his legacy. So what was Bridgewater? I carefully removed the photo from the album. On the back, in my mother's elegant cursive, was a date and a short inscription. Arthur and his partner, Daniel, celebrating the closing of the Henderson deal. Summer 1995. Partner, Daniel. My father had never, ever mentioned a partner. The story was always about him, a lone wolf, a self-made man. The word partner simply didn't exist in the Preston Holdings origin myth. Who was Daniel, and what happened to Bridgewater Development? A cold thrill, the kind I usually only got when I was close to uncovering a well-hidden financial discrepancy, ran down my spine. This was it. This was the thread. A discrepancy in the narrative. And if the story he told about his own company was a lie, what other lies was he telling? I took a picture of the photo with my phone and put the original back where I found it. I spent another hour in the attic, looking for any other mention of Bridgewater or Daniel, but there was nothing. It was a single, anomalous data point. For now. When I came back downstairs, Aunt Alina was sitting in her armchair, reading. She looked up as I entered. Find what you were looking for. I hesitated, then decided to show her the picture on my phone. Alina, do you know who this is? With my father. She put on her reading glasses and peered at the screen, her brow furrowed. Oh, my, I haven't seen a picture of Daniel in years. Daniel Peterson. They were partners, I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Aunt Alina took off her glasses and looked at me, her expression guarded. Yes, a long time ago, they started a small construction company together right after college. Bridgewater Development. They were best friends, inseparable. What happened to him? I pressed. And what happened to the company? She sighed, a heavy, sad sound. It's a long story, Violet, and not a happy one. They had a falling out, a bad one. After your mother and I lost our parents, we inherited a bit of money. Helen, your mother, convinced me to invest a large portion of it into their company. She trusted Arthur completely, and he and Daniel were doing so well. Then, it all fell apart. The company went bankrupt, or so Arthur told us. We lost everything we invested. Daniel left town not long after. Arthur said he'd been irresponsible, made some bad deals behind his back that ruined them. A few months later, Arthur started Preston Holdings. He told us he was starting over from scratch. I stared at her, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying speed. Bridgewater goes bankrupt. Daniel disappears. The investment from my mother and aunt is lost. And then, mere months later, my father, supposedly broke, starts a new, successful company all by himself. It didn't add up. The timeline was too clean, too convenient. Starting a company like Preston Holdings requires significant capital. Where did a man who had just been ruined in a bankruptcy get that kind of money? Alina, I said, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't start from scratch, did he? Her eyes filled with a deep, ancient sadness. Your father is a very complicated man, Violet. He can be very persuasive. He convinced everyone that Daniel betrayed him, that he was the victim. The victim? My father, the ultimate victim, who had built his empire on the ashes of his first company and the ruin of his best friend. The humiliation I felt at the wedding paled in comparison to the cold, hard fury that was now solidifying in my chest. This wasn't just about a cruel toast anymore. This was about a lie that sat at the very foundation of my family's fortune. And I, the failure of a daughter, the glorified bookkeeper, was the only person equipped to uncover it. The discovery of Bridgewater Development and the mysterious disappearance of Daniel Peterson changed everything. My mission was no longer a vague search for leverage. It now had a name and a starting point. For the next 3 weeks, I lived a double life. By day, I was Violet Preston, diligent forensic accountant for a mid-sized firm. By night, I was a detective, poring over public records, old news articles, and archived business filings in the digital catacombs of the internet. My first task was to find any official record of Bridgewater Development. It was harder than I expected. The company existed before the widespread digitization of records, so I had to dive into state and county archives, requesting physical copies of incorporation documents and dissolution filings. The process was slow and tedious, but it was familiar territory. It was what I did for a living. Finally, the documents arrived. A thick manila envelope landed on my desk, and I waited until I was home with a fresh pot of coffee to open it. The incorporation papers were straightforward: Bridgewater Develop Me. NT Inc., founded in 1993. The registered agents were Arthur Preston and Daniel Peterson. So far, the story checked out. Then I found the bankruptcy filing from 1996. It was a Chapter 7 liquidation. The documents painted a grim picture of a company collapsing under a mountain of debt. Creditors were listed, assets were valued at pennies on the dollar, and the final judgment was a complete dissolution of the company. On paper, it was a clean-cut business failure. Aunt Alina and my mother were listed among the unsecured creditors, meaning they got nothing back from their investment. It was all there in black and white, a legal testament to my father's story of ruin. But something felt wrong. A Chapter 7 liquidation of a development company should have left a trail of sold-off assets, land, equipment, partially finished projects. I cross-referenced the asset list from the bankruptcy with property records from that time. According to the filing, their main asset was a large plot of land zoned for a suburban housing development, the Henderson project my mother had mentioned on the back of the photo. The document stated the land was sold at a massive loss to a third-party investment group called Northgate Holdings LLC to pay off a fraction of the debt. Northgate Holdings LLC. The name was bland, anonymous. It sounded like 1,000 other shell corporations. On a hunch, I started digging into Northgate. This was where my professional skills really came into play. Using specialized databases my firm subscribed to, I began to peel back the layers of the corporate onion. It took me 2 days of meticulous work, tracing a convoluted path through a series of other LLCs and registered agents in different states, a classic tactic to obscure ownership. Finally, I hit the jackpot. The final layer of ownership, the ultimate beneficiary of Northgate Holdings, wasn't a faceless corporation. It was a trust. The sole trustee and beneficiary of that trust, Arthur Preston. I leaned back in my chair, the words on the screen blurring. I felt a wave of nausea. It wasn't just a lie. It was a meticulously planned act of fraud. He hadn't lost the Henderson project land at all. He had created a shell company, Northgate Holdings, to buy the land from his own failing company for a fraction of its worth during the bankruptcy auction. He had essentially sold the company's most valuable asset to himself, letting the shell company acquire it for pennies on the dollar. By declaring Bridgewater bankrupt, he wiped out his debts, including the money he owed to his creditors and the investment from my mother and my aunt. Then he used the very same land, now held under a different company name, as the seed capital to launch Preston Holdings just a few months later. He hadn't started from scratch. He had started with a stolen nest egg and a betrayed partner. The next step was to find Daniel Peterson. If I was going to expose this, I needed his story. Finding him was even harder than tracing the shell company. He had no social media presence, no digital footprint. It was as if he'd vanished after 1996. I hired a private investigator, a discreet professional D worked with on a complex fraud case a few years prior. I gave him the old photo and the name. "Find him," I said. "I just need to talk to him." While the pie worked, I continued to dig into Preston Holdings' financials. If my father was capable of this level of deceit once, he had likely done it again. For years, he had bemoaned my useless career choice, but he'd also, in a moment of paternal grandstanding, made me a minority shareholder in his company, granting me a tiny, non-voting percentage. It was a symbolic gesture, meant to be a reminder of the world I had chosen not to join. He never imagined I would use that status to legally request access to detailed shareholder reports and financial statements. When the thick annual reports arrived, I treated them like any other case file. I worked methodically, analyzing cash flows, vendor payments, and capital expenditures. It took me a week to find the pattern. My father was using a similar, albeit more sophisticated, method to skim profits from the company. He had set up several subsidiary companies that provided services to Preston Holdings: materials supply, architectural consulting, site management. These companies were charging Preston Holdings massively inflated rates for their services, funneling millions of dollars of profit out of the main company and into these smaller entities that he alone controlled. He was effectively stealing from his own company, hiding profits to reduce the company's taxable income and, more importantly, to devalue the shares of his other investors, many of whom were longtime employees he'd granted stock options to. He was robbing the very people who had helped him build his empire. The pie called me a week later. He'd found him. Daniel Peterson was living in a small town in Oregon, working as a high school woodshop teacher. He was divorced, lived alone, and according to the pie, kept to himself. He was not happy to be found, the pie warned. He sounds like a man who has buried the past for a reason. I booked a flight to Oregon for the following weekend. I had the documents, the proof of the fraud that had destroyed Bridgewater Development. I had uncovered the current scheme that was bleeding Preston Holdings dry. I had all the numbers, all the facts, but the numbers couldn't tell the whole story. For that, I needed to talk to the man my father had erased from his history. The flight to Oregon was the longest 5 hours of my life. I spent the entire time rehearsing what I would say, organizing the documents I had printed and placed in a sleek, professional binder. It felt like preparing for the most important audit of my career. I wasn't just presenting financial findings. I was about to excavate a life that had been deliberately buried. Daniel Peterson lived in a modest craftsman-style house on a quiet, tree-lined street. A lovingly tended garden filled the front yard. When I knocked on the door, it was answered by a man who looked much older than his late 50s. His hair was gray, his face was etched with deep lines of weariness, but his eyes, though guarded, were kind. He was holding a sanding block, and a fine layer of sawdust coated his flannel shirt. He looked nothing like the confident young man in the photograph. "Mr. Peterson?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "My name is Violet Preston. I'm Arthur Preston's daughter." His face closed down instantly. The kindness in his eyes vanished, replaced by a shuttered, pained expression. "I have nothing to say to any Preston," he said, his voice raspy. He started to close the door. "Please," I said, putting my hand out. "I know what he did to you, to Bridgewater Development. I have proof." He stopped, his hand still on the doorknob. He stared at me, his gaze intense, searching for any sign of the deception he associated with my last name. Proof of what? Proof that the bankruptcy was a sham. Proof that he used a shell company called Northgate Holdings to buy the Henderson property out from under the company and then used it to start Preston Holdings. Proof that he stole my mother's and my aunt's investment. He was silent for a long time, his eyes never leaving my face. Finally, he let out a long, slow breath that seemed to carry 30 years of weight with it. "You'd better come in," he said, opening the door wider. His house was filled with the scent of sawdust and varnish. Beautiful, handcrafted furniture was everywhere, chairs, tables, bookshelves. It was clear this was where he poured his life's passion now. We sat at a stunning kitchen table he had clearly built himself, and I opened my binder. For the next hour, I walked him through my findings, laying out the corporate filings, the property records, the trust documents. I spoke calmly and factually, just as I would with a client. He listened without interrupting, his eyes fixed on the papers. He traced the lines of ownership with his finger, a flicker of something, anger, validation, profound sadness, crossing his face. When I was finished, he leaned back in his chair and stared out the window. "I knew it," he whispered. "In my gut, I always knew it wasn't just bad luck, but I couldn't prove it. He was always smarter with the books than I was. I was the builder, the designer. He was the numbers guy, the charmer." He then told me his side of the story. He and Arthur had been like brothers. They had a shared dream. But as Bridgewater started to become successful, Arthur changed. He grew obsessed with wealth and status, frustrated with their slow and steady growth. He started making unilateral decisions, taking on debt, creating a complex financial structure that Daniel couldn't follow. Then, suddenly, Arthur declared they were on the brink of collapse. He painted a picture of utter ruin, convincing Daniel that bankruptcy was their only option. He promised they would rebuild together. "He told me the bankruptcy would be hard, that our reputations would take a hit," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "He said I should lay low, maybe even leave town for a while to let the dust settle. He said he'd call me when it was time to start again. I was so ashamed, I did what he said. I packed up and left. The call never came." He lost everything: his company, his savings, his reputation, and his best friend. The shame and stress led to the end of his marriage. He had spent years believing he was a failure, that his poor business sense had ruined them both. Arthur's betrayal had not just stolen his money, it had stolen his confidence, his identity. "He didn't just ruin me financially, Violet," Daniel said, his eyes meeting mine. "He hollowed me out. I haven't designed or built a house since. I couldn't. All the joy was gone." My heart ached for this man, my father. Hadn't just committed fraud, he had systematically destroyed a good person's life for his own personal gain. "What would you need to make this right?" I asked softly. He shook his head. "There's no making it right. The time is gone. But I want the truth to be known. I want the world to see him for who he really is, not the great man he pretends to be." That was all I needed to hear. My plan began to crystallize, no longer just about revenge, but about justice. It had to be clean, legal, and undeniable. A corporate takedown, executed not with emotion, but with the cold, hard facts. Over the next 2 weeks, Daniel and I worked together. He helped me fill in the historical gaps, providing context and details about the deals and projects that I only knew from the paperwork. My Aunt Alina also became a key part of the plan. As a jilted investor in Bridgewater, she had legal standing. I hired a sharp, aggressive corporate lawyer, laying out the entire case for him. He was stunned, then invigorated by the sheer audacity of the fraud. Together, we prepared a comprehensive package. It included my forensic analysis of both the original Bridgewater fraud and the current profit-skimming scheme at Preston Holdings. It included a sworn affidavit from Daniel Peterson detailing his experience. And it included a formal petition from Aunt Alina representing the defrauded original investors. The plan was simple. Preston Holdings had a board of directors and several key investors outside of my father. They believed in the myth of Arthur Preston, the self-made genius. They had no idea the company's foundations were built on sand and deceit, or that its current profits were being systematically siphoned off. I wouldn't confront my father at a family dinner. I wouldn't have a screaming match. I would do it in the one place he felt most powerful, the place where he was king, his boardroom. We would use my, Alina's, and other minority shareholders' rights to call an emergency board meeting. The agenda would be vague, a review of historical and current fiscal irregularities. He would walk into that room expecting a minor financial query. He would be met with the complete and total demolition of his legacy, presented in a binder just like the one I showed Daniel. The architect of the fall was not just me. It was a team, the betrayed partner, the cheated sister-in-law, and the failure of a daughter. We were about to present our final report. The day of the meeting, the air in the city felt charged with electricity. I wore my best suit, a charcoal gray armor of professionalism. In my briefcase was a leather-bound binder, identical copies of which had already been couriered to the offices of every board member and major investor of Preston Holdings, timed to arrive exactly 1 hour before the meeting. The element of surprise was crucial. I wanted them walking into that room already armed with the facts, their faith in my father already shaken. I met Aunt Alina and our lawyer, Mr. Davies, in the marble lobby of the Preston Holdings building. The opulent lobby, with its towering ceilings and a giant, abstract sculpture my father had commissioned, was designed to intimidate. Today, it felt like a stage set for a drama. Alina, usually so gentle, had a spine of steel. She was dressed in a simple but elegant navy dress, her expression calm and resolute. She was no longer just my supportive aunt. She was a woman seeking justice for her sister's stolen legacy. When we walked into the boardroom on the top floor, most of the members were already there, seated around the massive mahogany table. They were flipping through their copies of the binder, their faces a mixture of confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror. They were powerful people, bankers, real estate moguls, respected community leaders, and they did not like being made fools of. My father was the last to arrive. He strode in 5 minutes late, a power move he always employed. He was smiling, radiating confidence, completely oblivious to the storm that was about to break. He saw me sitting at the table next to an empty chair reserved for him, and his smile faltered, replaced by a look of sheer annoyance. "Violet, what is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice echoing in the silent room. "This is a closed meeting, and you," he said, gesturing dismissively at Alina, "have no business being here." "On the contrary, Arthur," Mr. Davies said, standing up. "Ms. Preston is here in her capacity as a shareholder, and your sister-in-law, Ms. Vance, is here as a petitioner with a formal grievance against the company's founder. As for the meaning of this meeting, I believe the documents you all received an hour ago make that quite clear." My father's eyes darted around the table, finally noticing the binders in front of everyone. He saw the title printed in gold leaf on the cover, "An Independent Forensic Audit of Bridgewater Development and Preston Holdings." Hi. S. face went pale. For the first time in my life, I saw genuine fear in my father's eyes. The mask of the indomitable patriarch slipped, revealing the cornered con man underneath. "This is absurd," he stammered, trying to regain control. "Some kind of ridiculous fabrication." "Is it, Arthur?" I said, my voice quiet but carrying across the room. I stood up and walked to the head of the table, where a projector screen was waiting. I clicked a button on my laptop, and the first slide appeared, a high-resolution image of the old photograph. Arthur and Daniel Peterson, smiling, celebrating a deal. Let's start at the beginning. For the next 45 minutes, I delivered a presentation. It was not emotional. It was not accusatory. It was a cold, methodical recitation of facts, figures, and timelines. I walked them through the creation of Bridgewater, the investment from my mother and aunt. I showed them the bankruptcy filing, and then, with damning clarity, I displayed the convoluted ownership trail of Northgate Holdings, leading directly to a trust in my father's name. I presented the property records, showing that the Henderson land, purchased for a pittance from his own bankrupt firm, became the foundational asset of Preston Holdings. The room was utterly silent, save for the sound of my voice and the rustling of pages as the board members followed along in their binders. My father just sat there, shrinking in his chair, his face ashen. Then, I moved on to the current scheme. I displayed the inflated invoices from his subsidiary companies, showing them exactly how millions of dollars were being siphoned away from the company they had all invested in. I showed them the real-time effect on their share values, projecting the millions they had collectively lost due to his greed. For 30 years, I concluded, my voice ringing with a strength I didn't know I possessed, The success of this company has been predicated on a foundational lie. A lie that destroyed one man's life, stole from my own family, and has been used to systematically defraud all of you. I clicked to the final slide. It was a simple quote from a legal textbook. Fraud vitiates every transaction. Fraud unravels everything. I sat down. The silence in the room was deafening. One of the board members, an old family friend named George, slowly took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Arthur, is this true? My father looked around the table, searching for an ally, but found only cold, disillusioned stares. The charisma, the power, it had all evaporated. He was just a man, exposed and stripped of his mythology. It was a business decision, he mumbled, his voice weak. A different time, I did what I had to do to survive. You did what you had to do to get rich, Eleanor said, her voice cutting through his pathetic excuse. You did it on my sister's money, money our parents left us. You let her believe you had failed, that her trust was misplaced. You let her carry that disappointment until the day she died. That was the blow that finally broke him. The mention of my mother, the one person whose memory he had tried to sanctify, shattered his last defense. He slumped in his chair, utterly defeated. The rest was a formality. Mr. Davies laid out the options. They could fight this in court, a move that would make the scandal public, destroy the company's reputation, and likely lead to criminal charges for my father. Or they could handle it internally. The board voted. It was unanimous. Arthur Preston was to resign as CEO and chairman, effective immediately. He would be forced to sell back his majority shares to the company at a severely reduced valuation to begin repaying the funds he had siphoned. A settlement fund would be established to compensate the original investors of Bridgewater, with Daniel Peterson and my Aunt Eleanor's family being the primary beneficiaries. The company would undergo a complete restructuring. As the meeting adjourned, my father walked past me. He didn't look at me. He looked old and small and utterly broken. There was no triumph in that moment, only a profound, quiet sadness. He had built his entire world on a lie, and with a few simple truths, I had brought it all crashing down. He had humiliated me in a room full of people to feel powerful. I had dismantled his entire life in a room full of his peers to find justice. The aftermath of the board meeting was not loud and explosive, but quiet and seismic. The tremors of my father's downfall rippled through the company and our family, rearranging the entire landscape of our lives. Arthur disappeared from public view. He resigned, as demanded, and moved into a smaller condo, his vast fortune reduced to a comfortable, but by his standards, humiliatingly modest living stipend. The empire was gone. The king was dethroned. The company, under a new CEO appointed by the board, began the painful process of restructuring. They were transparent with the investors about the financial misconduct, framing it as the actions of a single rogue founder who had been held accountable. It was a difficult period, but by exposing the fraud, I had ultimately saved the company from a slower, more corrosive collapse. The rot had been cut out. My primary concern was ensuring justice was served. The settlement for Daniel Peterson was substantial. It wasn't just the value of his original stake in Bridgewater, but a figure that accounted for 3 decades of lost growth and earnings. I flew back to Oregon to deliver the news in person. When I told him the amount, he just stared at me, tears welling in his eyes. It wasn't about the money itself, it was the validation. It was the world finally acknowledging what had been done to him. You know, he said to me over coffee in his workshop, I think I might start designing again, just a small project, for myself. That, more than anything, felt like a true victory. Aunt Eleanor used her portion of the settlement to establish a literary scholarship at her local library in my mother's name. It was a beautiful, fitting tribute. Your mother always believed in helping people build their own foundations, she told me at the dedication ceremony. Arthur only ever cared about building his own. The most complicated part was navigating my own feelings. There was no triumphant feeling of I told you so. Seeing my father stripped of everything he valued, his power, his status, his wealth left me with a hollow ache. He was a man who had built his identity on a lie, and without it, there was very little left of him. He tried to reach out a few times, leaving rambling, self-pitying voicemails. I never answered. There was nothing left to say. Forgiveness was a mountain I wasn't ready to climb, perhaps never would be. The wound he'd inflicted at that wedding wasn't just an insult. It was the final symptom of a lifelong disease of cruelty and narcissism. You can't heal a relationship when the other person is the source of the sickness. Sophia, my cousin, did not take her benefactor's fall gracefully. Her funding dried up overnight. The fairy tale life, subsidized by my father's stolen millions, vanished. She had to sell her lavish apartment, cancel the exotic trips, and her online presence shifted from aspirational luxury to bitter complaints. She blamed me, of course, sending me a string of furious texts accusing me of being jealous and vindictive. I never replied. Her anger was a reflection of her own shallow values, the same values my father had championed. She was his true daughter in the end. 6 months after the board meeting, I was promoted to partner at my firm. My work on the Preston Holdings case, though kept confidential, had earned me a reputation as a forensic accountant of unparalleled skill and integrity. I had found my power not in a boardroom or on a stage, but in the quiet, methodical pursuit of truth. I've learned that real strength isn't about public declarations of success. It's not about the flawless image or the grand toast. It's about a quiet, unshakable integrity. It's about knowing your own worth, even when the world or your own family tells you that you are a failure. My father tried to define me with one cruel, public sentence, but he was wrong. I wasn't the failure sulking in the back. I was the accountant, and I was just waiting for the right moment to balance the books. And in the end, the numbers never lie.